The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we delve into the science of the nose. The middle sister to its siblings, vision and hearing, smell is often ignored when we talk about sensory experience. But today is not that day. Stay tuned to learn the ins and outs of how we smell and the language we use to talk about it. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Jessie Yaros. Today we're talking with Dr. Asifa Majid, a professor of language, communication, and cultural cognition at Radboud University. She investigates the nature of categories and concepts in language, and most recently, the linguistics around our sense of smell. Dr. Majid, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to talk to you.
Now, you co-authored a paper with a linguist and collaborator, Nicole Crisp, that was published online this month in the journal Current Biology, and the title is Hunter-Gatherer Olfaction is Special. So at the heart of this paper is the question of whether olfaction, or the sense of smell, and the way it's described in language is different for hunter-gatherers than it is for other groups, specifically groups whose lifestyles are more agricultural or farming-based. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, we're trying to understand what underlies the differences between groups of people and their ability to talk about smells.
Before we dive into the heart of it, could you contextualize this paper for us? It seems a follow-up to some research you published several years ago about a separate hunter-gatherer group called the Jahai.
Yeah, so for centuries, really, we've had this presumption in the West that odors are impossible to talk about. So we can trace this back to such classical thinkers as Plato, who thought that there were no words for smells, that we only distinguish them according to whether they're good or bad smells. And this idea has really permeated all of our thinking. So people often speculate about how hard it is to talk about the things that we're smelling. So we had previously tried to test whether this presumption was in fact universally true. And to do that, we had compared speakers of the language Jahai who live in the Malay Peninsula. And we had compared them to English speakers to see how they talked about smells and in comparison also to colours. What we found in that previous study was that it was in fact true that English speakers struggled to name smells when they couldn't see them. So while they agreed with one another in how to describe different shades of colours, when they had to describe even familiar smells like coffee or chocolate, they couldn't identify the sources very well. And in fact, they were giving completely different descriptions from one another. Whereas for the Jahai, they were just as consistent in how they talked about smells as they were in talking about colours. And when we looked more closely, we found that, in fact, they had dedicated words to talk about different qualities of smells. So just like we have basic words to talk about colour, so red, green, blue, the Jahai have words that pick out different qualities of smell. So they're only used for smells. They're not used for taste or objects. And they apply to different objects in the world. So for example, the word ba'us describes a sort of musty sort of smell that you might find in old dwellings or cooked cabbage or cooked rice. So these words seem to pick out an odour quality that apply across a range of objects. And there's around a dozen or so of these words in Jahai. So the Jahai were using these smell words to describe different qualities in a consistent way. And that's very unlike what we see in the West. That's
interesting because so the way we use the word red, it's in sort of abstract word. There's nothing inherent in the name that defines, things that are red. So is this what that word or those 12 words are like? They don't inherently, represent what they smell like in terms of a source?
That's right. So if we were going to list objects that were red, it could be anything from a fire engine to a tomato, a t-shirt. So it's picking out a quality, a visual quality. And in the same way, these smell words seem to be picking out a smell quality. So Radboud, for example, is used for fragrant sorts of smells. So flowers, soap, a bear cat that smells a little bit like popcorn. But it's a different sort of smell from jungos smells, which are fragrant smells that are more edible sorts of smells. So they would be cooked chicken, for example, would be the smell of cooked chicken would be a good example for that one. So there's a quality in common between these things, but the words themselves don't refer to any object. Right. And like I said, you can't use it for taste. So you couldn't say, oh, this tastes jungos. It only refers to the smell. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
this research is amazing, but it did pose some questions because you were comparing the Jahai speakers to English speakers. And the cultures are so different that it's really hard to pin down why they might be better at describing or detecting odors. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. So when we compare two very different groups like this, it's very hard to know what exactly underlies the difference. So we have, speakers of a language spoken by millions of people. There's only around 1,000 Jahai speakers today. We have, English speakers living in urban centres, but also, rural lifestyle, whereas the Jahai are much more homogenous. So they're mostly nomadic hunter-gatherers traditionally in their lifestyle. We have English speakers are all literate, reading and writing, but the Jahai aren't. So they differ on many different parameters. So if we want to really find out why some languages have smell words and others don't, it's hard to know just from this one comparison. And we don't know whether it's the English that are unusual and not having words, or whether it's the Jahai that are, unusual somehow in having developed a small vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. And this issue is one of the reasons you conducted this most recent experiment, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So there's different approaches one can take to answer the question of what underlies these differences. But what we tried to do was compare two related communities. So the Samapburi and the Semalai are both related to the Jahai. They live in similar environment in the Malay Peninsula. It's a tropical rainforest environment. They speak related languages. So if the Jahai were like the Germans in this community, the Semalai and the Samapburi are like the French and Italians, say. Mm-hmm. So they all are related to one another, but the languages aren't mutually intelligible. But the critical difference in this study was that the Samapburi are like the Jahai in that they're both hunter-gatherer. They're both living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But the Semalai are horticulturalists, so they do small-scale farming. So they cut down a little bit of the forest in Sweden and grow rice just for their own consumption. So the two groups differ in their cultural subsistence, but otherwise their environments are shared, they're speaking similar languages. So it controls for many of the parameters that might underlie the differences we found previously between English and Jahai.
So what was the exact task that you gave them?
The task is really simple. So we're working with we want to have a task that we can use with people who might not necessarily have literacy, as I just described. So all they have to do is name colors and name smells. So they're both relatively abstract. The colors are just standardized, what are called Munsell chips. So we know exactly which hue we're giving to people. And the smells were sniffing sticks. So these are standardized way to give odors. So they're basically like a marker pen that have different odors inside them. So they're not attached to an object. People can't see where the odor's coming from. So they're just given these colors and smells and have to say what the smell is or what the color is.
Okay. And what were your major findings, the differences between the two groups?
So what we found was that the Semilai, the small-scale farmers, were just like the English speakers. So they agreed with one another in how to describe the colours, but they struggled to name the smells. Whereas the Sumapburi looked just like the Jahai. So they found smells just as easy to talk about as colours.
Okay, and I want to clarify this early on because there's a distinction. There's agreement between different people on what the smells are. So agreement in how they describe the smells rather than an actual potentially better sense of smell. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in this study, we're focusing on odor, olfactory language, because of these claims that have been made about the way that language and olfaction hook up to one another, or the lack of ability to talk about smells. We did not test perception. Okay. So far, but obviously that's a interesting next question to ask. Yeah.
So hypothetically, each group could be smelling the same exact thing. But it could be like, when us English speakers, we smell something and we're like, oh, I really recognize the smell, but it's on the tip of my tongue. What is that smell? So it's like we can perceive it potentially as well, but we may not be able to describe it because we have no language for it.
Yeah. So, in the last few years, there have been some wonderful studies showing that our sense of smell, which is often much maligned, where people think that, where we don't have a good ability. In fact, the experimental research shows that we have amazing noses. We can discriminate trillions of odors, according to some counts. We're able to follow a trail of chocolate scent across the field with our noses. So we really do have a remarkable olfactory sense. Yeah, for English speakers, there seems to be some gap that means that it's harder for us to talk about smells.
So why would having a language for smell help hunter-gatherers specifically in their everyday life?
So I think it's important to contextualize the olfaction in the broader sense. So I think it likely does have a role to play in their subsistence. So especially in the tropical rainforest surrounding, odors can give you a lot of information, and sometimes even before you can see a thing, you can smell it. So for people who are either tracking game or looking for a particular kind of fruit, it can be helpful to pay attention to that information, but it's part of a wider network of beliefs and activities that are important for the Sumapburi and Jahai beyond just the subsistence itself. So, for example, the Sumapburi and the Jahai believe that certain odors can make you sick and other odors can make you better. They have taboo against cooking some sorts of meats on the same fire. So in fact, they'll build two separate fires to cook two different sorts of meat. They believe that individuals have a smell soul, and that if brother and sister sit too close together, it's a kind of smell incest. And so they monitor odors. They monitor social odors, other object odors is part of their conscious awareness. And so being able to communicate about that is important because olfaction underlies a number of their cultural activities.
That's amazing. I mean, the fact that the smell is, as you said, maligned in Western culture potentially compared to other sensory modalities like, sight and hearing, but it seems to be valued in these cultures.
Absolutely. And in a sense, it's not clear why we don't value our sense of smell more. So it's obviously important for us. We spend billions in the flavor and fragrance industry. And people who have lost their sense of smell, who suffer from anosmia, report that, food doesn't have the same pleasure anymore because much of our sense of flavor comes from our sense of smell. And so when they're not able to use their noses in the same way, the pleasure of food goes. Their social relationships also seem to suffer because they can't smell their loved ones in the same way, but also they start to worry about their own smells. So we know that smell is also important for us, and yet it's not something that we're very reflective about. It doesn't seem to be part of our conscious awareness in the same way, and it's definitely something that we don't communicate about to the same extent as the communities that we've been studying seem to.
Yeah, so it seems that we may not realize that smell is so important until we've lost it.
That's right.
So you mentioned that the Samapbari have, different social cues from smells, and that smells have all these different meanings for them. So we talked earlier about perception, and this really poses a question about whether these cultural differences and how we talk about odors are associated with cultural differences in sensitivity to odors. So I know we don't have any data on this yet, but what would you imagine? Do you think that hunter-gatherers have a stronger sense of smell?
I think it's possible. There are some interesting cross-cultural findings that have been published that show that, for example, the Tsemane, who live in Bolivia, are better at detecting and discriminating odors than a comparable German group. And in this research, it's been suggested that perhaps that's got something to do with the environment. So, living in an industrial world where there's much more pollution, the pollution affects our ability to smell. So perhaps in a more traditional environment where you're not being exposed to car fumes and other sorts of fumes, the sense of smell might be better. So I think it's possible that there are differences across populations in perception, but it also raises that question of how exactly environment and biology are connected to one another.
Mm-hmm. And do you think how would you test this in the groups that you've been working with if you wanted to?
There's a number of questions that are open for us, I think. So one could look at the ability just to detect an odor. So how much of that odor do you need before you smell that something is there? So that's quite low level perception in a way. But I think something that's quite exciting for us to pursue is whether people across different communities perceive odors in the same way. Do they discriminate odors in the same way? Do they think the same odors are pleasant or unpleasant? So there's a number of different questions that it would be exciting to investigate further.
So really these odors could basically have different meanings to people based on the cultural relevance of them.
I think both possibilities are exciting. So either perception is shared across people. We smell things in the same way, and it's language that's different, which means that we need to understand how language and perception connect. Or these effects really go down deep and perception itself is underlyingly different. And if that's the case, then we would want to understand better what causes what. How do language, culture, environment, how do these all interact? So I think both possibilities are very exciting, and we just need the empirical data to be able to understand better how these things align.
It is an interesting case where it's whatever is the case and is true is going to be exciting and interesting.
That's it.
Yeah. I am curious, though. I mean, there's a large body of literature on expertise, visual expertise, and gustatory taste with, bird experts and car experts and sommeliers. So would you think that smelling could be just there is a perception, it would be a form of expertise that's learned, or rather some sort of genetic enhancement over years of the hunter-gatherer communities and being isolated from other communities?
So I think, at least as it concerns olfactory language, certainly practice seems to have a lot to do with it. So in one study, we've compared wine experts with novices in their ability to talk about the smells and flavors of wines versus just everyday smells and flavors. And in that study, we found that wine experts were indeed more consistent in how they talked about the smells and flavors of wines, but that didn't generalize to everyday flavors and smells. So if we compared a wine expert's ability to name a banana smell or a chocolate smell to somebody who wasn't a wine expert, there was no difference. Mm-hmm. So that suggests that there's something about the specific practices that the wine experts are using, which is wine tasting, I think, is the real place there. So, doing blind tastings, just talking with other people who are doing them, what exactly are the aromas that are being picked up, helps to tune in the wine experts and also just conventionalize that vocabulary so that my personal experience and your personal experience are aligned and we know how we're using this vocabulary. So I think language in that sense is helpful for one's own thinking. It helps make things more concrete and it enables you to keep them in mind. But it's also a way for us to align our perceptions. Mm-hmm. So kind of going back to the question that you asked about, what's the purpose of communicating about these things? It's a way for us to make sure that we're aligned in our experiences. Otherwise, we're all in our own private worlds, experiencing our own perceptual, input.
So do you believe it is possible to disentangle the contributions of lifestyle, culture, environment, and language then to potential perception, or whether it's just linguistic differences?
I think we can definitely gain more insights than we have right now. So, to the study that I was just describing, where the wine experts are a bit better, one could argue that, well, what makes a person a wine expert in the first place? Perhaps they have some biological advantage in smell and that makes them interested in smell. And so they go on to become a wine expert. So perhaps practice plays a limited role there. So you can, in fact, investigate that by taking people who are not necessarily interested in the same way and training them up. Mm-hmm. You can test comparable people with different levels of expertise and see what role practice does play. So there's a number of different approaches that can be taken to make it an empirical question and not just speculation.
Well, it's really interesting. And do you know what's next for you?
I think the perception question that you asked is certainly something that's occupying my mind at the moment. I think to understand how language and perception are coupled in this case would be very exciting.
Are there any other major interesting things that you've been thinking about or been occupying your mind that we didn't talk about?
Aside from the perception part of things, there is the connection between language and other aspects of thinking. Mm-hmm. So, whether having olfactory language might have an influence on the way that we remember smells, for example. So I think, one could ask whether people with an olfactory language are also better at remembering smells, mm-hmm. and whether the kind of asymmetry that we see between vision and smell in language for English speakers and the simile, whether that's also reflected in other cognitive things like our abilities to remember. So I think that would be, I'd love for more data on that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because smell is definitely, compared to other senses, it has this very strong attachment to memory. It seems you could smell something and it just places you somewhere that you haven't been in years, but you know where.
There's different aspects of memory, isn't there? So there's a specific odor that you smell. Was it this particular rose scent, or was it a different kind of floral scent? Mm-hmm. And then there's a kind of episodic memory that you're alluding to. So, you know, the Proustian idea that a particular smell might take you back to, you know, your grandmother's house when you were little. Or, There does seem to be a special connection between odors and these episodic memories. And Maria Larsson from Stockholm University in Sweden has done some very interesting work comparing smell with other sensory modalities to see how exactly these odor memories are connected to autobiographical memories.
But at the end of the day, even if we're transported back to Grandma's house, it doesn't mean we can say what exactly we're smelling, does it?
No, that's right. And perhaps that's part of the reason that it is able to do that. Yeah. Because we're connecting it, you know, to that type of memory instead of our conscious memories, our semantic memories.
Dr. Majid, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise in the language of the nose.
Thank you.
If you're interested in learning more about Dr. Asifa Majid's research, you can follow her on Twitter at Asifa Majid. That's ASIFA_Majid. To find that handle and links to her webpage, navigate to our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. Thanks.
We'll be right back after this.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People.
I'm Jessie Yaros. Today, we're talking with Dr. J. Gottfried, a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint faculty appointments in the Department of Neurology and Psychology. He joined recently as a Penn Integrates Knowledge University professor. His research investigates the neurobiology of our sense of smell and how smell is intertwined with memory, emotion, and perception. Dr. Gottfried, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to get metaphysical on you. What is a smell?
Always the tough questions. Well, a smell is a chemical molecule which travels through the air and gets to our nose, activating our olfactory pathway. One interesting thing about odor molecules is they have to be volatile enough and light enough so that they can kind of rise through the air and make contact with our noses. There's many molecules out there that are too heavy for us even to smell because they don't kind of get off the ground. In fact, that's probably one reason why animals like dogs and rodents have such a good sense of smell, because their noses are always down on the ground where they can pick up things that humans just aren't normally going to be trying to do.
So if we just crawled more to where we needed to go, we might have a better sense of smell?
Exactly, right? There's actually there's some old, it's not really research, observations about how, or really just speculations, that one reason that the human sense of smell probably isn't quite as refined as that of other animals is when we learned to walk on 2 feet, our noses were suddenly no longer close to the ground.
That's fascinating. And we'll get to more of the differences between our olfaction systems and other animals later. But once you mention the volatile chemicals get to the nose, you mentioned they activate the olfactory pathway. So can you break down the olfactory pathway for us?
Sure. So really the first step in this process by which we smell things is when the odor molecules drift into our nose and contact kind of the very upper reaches our nose, sort of an area way beyond where you could get a pencil. So this is the area known as the olfactory epithelium. It has a mucus layer to keep it moist. And basically, when an odor molecule arrives at this mucus layer, it's quickly kind of absorbed through the mucus and binds to these receptor endings of olfactory sensory neurons. There's really cool electron microscopy photographs where people basically took pictures of the olfactory epithelium at 500 to 2,000 times size. And it's just it looks like a beautiful forest, with these sea anemone kind of tentacle things, which are all of the surfaces that odors can bind to. So there's this incredible surface area, for odors to bind, onto the olfactory sheet. And probably accounts for why, even the human nose can probably detect just, a dozen, discrete molecules of one odor. I could put that differently. Basically, we can detect certain odors at parts per trillion. And I think the rich surface area available in the nose makes that possible. So that's the first step. From there, the axons, kind of the conducting fibers leaving the nose, basically pass through tiny holes in the skull. This area of the skull is called the cribriform plate, and there's lots of little holes there for these thin olfactory nerve fibers to pass through, and they end up synapsing on kind of the first goalpost, which is the olfactory bulb.
And by synapsing, you mean connecting?
Exactly, kind of creating an electrical connection between the sensory neurons in the nose and the kind of the first junction point in the olfactory system of the brain. And the fact that all these tiny nerves are passing through delicate bone right at the base of the skull has an important clinical implication, because oftentimes if people are in a bad car accident and kind of jostle their brain, those olfactory nerves are so delicate they can be severed. So smell loss is actually a pretty common consequence of traumatic brain injuries. Anyhow, so the first synapse is at the olfactory bulb. So that information goes to the olfactory bulb, where there's basically a handshake between the kind of distant endings of the receptor neurons, and then the output of that now projects to the next stage in the system, which is principally known as the piriform cortex, which is the major projection point of the olfactory bulb.
The olfactory bulb is a much older part of the brain, right?
Well, so that gets into a complex question, but I do think that evolutionarily the sense of smell is probably among the earliest senses to evolve. Kind of if we take a step back for a second, pretty much every species you could think of uses a sense of smell in some way or other. So you could even imagine the earliest unicellular creatures, like an E. coli bacterium. There have been interesting bacteriology studies done on these small critters, showing that they have a cluster of olfactory chemoreceptor complexes at one end of the cell. And what this means is it has a kind of polarity, sort of like a nose, so that it can sensibly navigate its way through, the pond, following concentration gradients in order to find nutrients it needs and to get away from toxins such as its own waste products. So even in E. coli or some whatever bacterium, there's a kind of primordial sense of smell, allowing it to kind of approach things it needs and avoid things it's trying to get away from.
Right.
And so if you trace this through, the evolutionary hierarchy, sense of smell is very important for all sorts of kinds of behavioral aspects, whether it's finding food, finding mates, recognizing friends from foe, avoiding various predator threats. So, and what's cool about the sense of smell is it's a distant sense. So it really allows an organism to sense things from afar, and well before, it's too late to make a move and get away from T-Rex or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So it could be, you could smell things well before you could potentially hear them or see them?
Right. Yeah. So, each of the senses evolved under slightly different pressures, to accomplish different tasks. But, what you mentioned is a great example. Smells can defy physical barriers and physical obstacles. They can, curve around hilltops and buildings, so that you can smell things even if you can't see them.
You were saying that there is something different about smells and the way that they're processed. And I feel like we can tell this when we perceive certain things. Like if, you smell something and it just completely transports you back to a time and place, and you can see where you are and you remember where you are. Whether it's like, a family member's home cooking or somewhere where you traveled. So that doesn't happen with visual and auditory cues, does it?
Well, I tend to agree with you on all of that. And definitely when people describe these kind of flashbacks in time to early childhood triggered by a smell, I've had that. I totally believe in that. I think it's been a little difficult to prove it, though. Mm-hmm. Just kind of, in an experimental lab setting, to prove that odors are more provocative than other stimuli. But I think it makes sense. But certainly, I'm sure there are plenty of examples where you hear a song and that transports you right back. Mm-hmm. And probably if you look at certain photographs, right, that'll transport you back. So there is something. I think part of the reason it does seem so remarkable when an odor does that is because a lot of people generally don't really think about the sense of smell very much. They take it for granted. Even traditional neuroscience research on the senses, smell is always kind of the last one mentioned. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain kind of, it's not an active bias, but people it's not really on their radar.
Right.
But certainly I know people who are very tuned into the sense of smell, and for them, it's a very intrinsic part of their human experience.
So who do you know that's particularly tuned into their sense of smell?
Me? No. So I think, first of all, traditionally, women who often had roles in the kitchen, and were, much more often using perfume, like there's a sensibility there, about the sense of smell that is, just much more prominent. There's a fairly small literature, but very suggestive literature that maybe even biologically, kind of at an innate level, women have a better sense of smell. Mm-hmm. So I think anyone who needs to use their nose as part of their work life or personal life will learn how to improve their sense of smell. So whether it's a wine tasters, wine sommelier, people in the food industry, people who work in perfumery or in kind of flavor and fragrance development. Mm-hmm. I think for those people to do their job, there probably does have to be a certain amount of innate aptitude, but I also think there's a lot of plasticity, and you can learn through experience to become a better smeller.
which it sounds like maybe your interest in smell has caused you to do, or have you always felt that you noticed smells more, and did that cause you to become a neuroscientist of smell?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I do know that based on the photograph, when I was about 6 months old, I showed a very strong reaction to a certain baby food that my grandma was trying to feed me.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been very tuned into smell.
I guess you bring up this point though about over time there may be people who have learned to have heightened senses of smell, which kind of brings up a topic that I discussed with another guest on this episode, Asifa Majid. And so she and Nicole Crespe published a paper recently on hunter-gatherers and how they have not an enhanced sense of smell, but have a language for smell where they're able to label smells much more readily than similar people in non-hunter-gatherer societies. So we talked briefly about, whether a language for smell could it lead to an enhanced perception of smell? But there's no testing on that. What do you think? Do you think hunter-gatherers are more attuned to smells, or just that they've learned this language and so they just are more aware of them, or they actually can smell better?
Well, I think that the jury's still out on a lot of those questions. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to work with those populations, and the work that Majid and others have done is really admirable. I think to what extent these reflect kind of innate processes that their brains are endowed with, or maybe have inherited over millennia, is a possibility. But as I was mentioning, I think experience counts for a lot. Mm-hmm. We did a study some years ago where we had two odors that smelled exactly the same, and in what's called basically a three-way forced choice test, where you get the two odors. So you get two of one odor and one of the other odor. People are at chance, right? Because 1 in 3, you'll name the right odor. Mm-hmm. But after we do Pavlovian conditioning, where we pair a mild electric shock to the foot in combination with one of those two smells, what we find is that the subjects are now better able to distinguish those two smells that were formerly indistinguishable. Right. And we also find that in piriform cortex, there's kind of been a qualitative change in the way that this information is coded in form of a pattern. Mm-hmm. So what was interesting about that study is it shows that the human sense of smell can be highly plastic, and that this correlates with kind of a reorganization in the way that smells are being encoded in the brain. So that's sort of a long way of saying my guess is that there are multiple factors that may be leading to the unique observations in the hunter-gatherers. We've done a little bit of work ourselves on odor naming in basically healthy Western subjects, and found that, or put forward the proposition that one reason it's so hard to name smells is, again, going back to the anatomy. As I said before, the olfactory system kind of arose as a way to implement emotions, memories, behaviors, but not so much to integrate with, higher order decision making and naming of smells and so on. Mm-hmm. Going back to the way that the olfactory system is set up to process memories and emotions and behaviors, there just wasn't ever an expedient way to map odor information onto those higher order cortical structures. Mm-hmm. So I think when someone tries to name a smell, it's just a much more it's a, how can I put it? When people try and name a smell, the ability to integrate the smell information with that kind of rich assortment of lexical semantics, words and concepts, is just a lot more sparse than, for example, in the visual system, where there are so many different opportunities for information to integrate and mix.
Now, you mentioned that the smell arising and having to do with the implementation of emotion. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Well, sort of as I was saying before, I view emotion as kind of the a phenomenon in which an animal is motivated to alter its behavior, whether to escape something in the case of fear, whether to attack something in the case of anger, whether to wrinkle your nose and slide away in the case of disgust. All these emotions are very much evoked by smells, which again gets back to the point that the so-called function of a smell is to motivate behavior. So that's how I kind of view the links between smells and emotion and behavior. It's kind of all part of the same arc.
Well, I just have a couple of more questions just about smell in general, because, you mentioned earlier it's like the ignored sense, right?
Right.
We have a word, like an obvious word for lack of sight and lack of hearing. We got blind and deafness. And so there's no word that comes to mind to me for, lack of smell. But are there clinical conditions where there are major smell deficits?
Yeah, the general term which you can bill for is anosmia.
Not doesn't have a ring to it. Anosmia.
Well, osmia means smell, and
okay.
an means none.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, anosmia, and it can come in different forms. It can be complete, which would be that would be complete anosmia, or it could be hyposmia, where it's reduced. It could be hyperosmia, where it's enhanced. It could be phantosmia, where you're getting smells that aren't really there. And this is another case where I think it's actually been a bit of a unfortunate situation for the millions of people who have smell disorders, because, there just isn't a lot of appreciation or recognition that this takes place. But it's more common than you would think. I would say a majority of patients who have had a traumatic will have some sort of smell impairment. As we mentioned before, whether it's due to kind of shearing those olfactory nerves as they pass through the thin bone of the cribriform plate. It could be from contusion to the base of the frontal lobe, in what's known as kind of coup contra coup ricochet injury that takes place inside the head, where you could end up injuring either the olfactory bulb or the orbitofrontal cortex or cortex. They're all kind of in the same general area where there's kind of bony shelves that can damage those brain regions. So traumatic brain injury is a big one. Someone who has a bad head cold could end up losing their sense of smell, where there is sort of so much inflammation and maybe, as you were alluding to, so much damage to the stem cell neurons that are helping regenerate the olfactory epithelium. It just never comes back. So that's another big one. Of course, there's also, sinus disease, rhinosinus disease, which would be kind of nose and sinus, in which is probably at least more correctable than someone who's had a viral infection and lost their sense of smell, or someone who has had TBI. In those instances, if you have a markedly deviated septum or or nasal polyps, those can be corrected.
Right. So it seems the difference between something that's wrong with I guess, the nose or sinus as opposed to the brain.
Right. Although, again, remember the olfactory epithelium, which has all of those receptor neurons, is in the nose, not the brain.
Yeah, fine line.
Yep.
So, you mentioned phantom smells, and I have to ask, more hallucinations that are smells?
Yeah, you got that right. There's not a whole lot of kind of formal clinical research done on this. I'd say that a well-documented phantom smell could arise from seizures. Sorry, a lot of seizures emerge from the temporal lobes, which is where hippocampus and amygdala piriform. And so if you have irritated cortex from whatever reason, whether it was, I don't know, multiple sclerosis, a very small stroke, maybe an infection in that area of the brain, you can, or, what's really common among epilepsy patients with the medial temporal lobe epilepsy is something called mesial temporal sclerosis. If that, ends up triggering the smell pathway, you can get these phantom smells. And sometimes patients will come to attention in the epilepsy clinic because they're complaining of phantom smells, but usually those are to more serious problems. But it's definitely not unheard of, and I think seizures are probably the most clinically relevant tie-in to phantosmia. But there can be other kinds of phantom smells. I've seen some of these sorts of patients in the clinic where we never really have a good answer. Some of it could be due to kind of a protein causing kind of micro nerve demyelination and injury, so that, again, there's kind of a aberrant regrowth of some of these nerves. This could happen at the level of the nose or even the tongue, deficits in taste function as well. I have to say there's also definitely a population of people on medications or patients with psychiatric disease who also experience these phantom smells. And those situations can be more difficult to treat.
Before we move on, when I was looking into this, I saw one called parosmia. Is that correct?
Yeah, parosmia is just a kind of a more generic term about kind of a qualitative change in the way they smell things.
Okay, because what I read was that it seems like phantom smell unpleasant. It says typically a burning, rotting, fecal, or chemical smell.
Right. I would say the majority of cases of phantosmia are like that. Parosmia is a little bit in the sense that some of these people, they'll smell strawberries and they'll think it smells bad.
Okay, so it's not a hallucination, it's just...
Right.
Okay. Well, you just mentioned now the connection to the tongue, and you said you were a picky eater, and I know I was a picky eater. I always had to, plug my nose when I would eat things that I didn't like, So, I mean, clearly there's some connection, even in experience, between smell and taste. So what exactly is this connection in the brain?
Well, it's an interesting question, which deserves unpacking. When I see patients with smell loss in the clinic, they're usually telling me that they have a problem with their taste. Mm. So there's a kind of semantic confusion about all of this. In my mind, smells happening in the nose, taste, which is salty, sweet, sour, bitter, and savory, is happening on the tongue at the taste buds. But the fact is, when we ingest a food and chew it, and we're getting all these different properties, percepts from that food. So we're getting the olfactory components, we're getting the taste, salty, sweet, sour, bitter components, and we're getting the tactile and textural components. We integrate information probably in areas like the insula and the orbitofrontal cortex. But our kind of integrated perception tells us this food is in the mouth. And we don't really perceive we don't perceive the odorous components of that food taking place in the nose, when in fact it does. And you can easily test that just by pinching your nose closed when you're eating a food, and then suddenly you'll lose all those nuances of the flavor, like whether it's strawberry or chocolate or banana, whatever the case. So yeah, there is a lot of integration that goes on, probably in higher order brain areas.
So it's not an immediate thing that happens. Like the integration takes place later on.
Well, we don't totally know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you say takes place later on, I think we're still talking about on the millisecond time scale as opposed to seconds.
Yeah.
Although, like people who like wine sometimes still talk kind of the initial impression, and then the like how a one sip of wine will evolve in time.
Deepens.
Where, right, you'll pick up certain notes on the tongue initially, and then it will evolve. And that could reflect the fact that some of the heavier volatile chemical notes in the wine take longer to basically kind of vaporize and travel from your mouth through your nasopharynx and then through your nose.
Well, and that brings us full circle to where we started.
Indeed.
Before we wrap up, I have one more important question. What is your favorite smell?
Well, as you'd see on my website, my favorite smell is shiso leaf, which is a member of the mint family and is used pretty commonly in Asian cuisine, especially Vietnamese and Japanese. It just has a subtle aroma that I think is just really heavenly. And I guess my number 2 would be curry leaf, which obviously is used in Indian cooking. And the fresh curry leaf also has to be loosely related to shiso. It also has just this really kind of warm, wonderful fragrance to it.
Yeah, I've smelled curry leaves, but I'll have to look into shiso next.
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Dr. Gottfried, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise in the neural basis of smell.
My pleasure. I hope this has been edifying.
If you're interested in learning more about Dr. J. Gottfried's research, you can navigate to his lab's website at hosting.med.upenn.edu/Gottfried Lab. If you didn't catch that, you can find that link and more on our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. Until next time.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.